É uma honra para o Instituto de Estudos Avançados desta universidade receber o professor Noam Chomsky no contexto das comemorações do 10º aniversário do Instituto de Estudos Avançados. Esta vida do professor Chomsky foi resultou de um conjunto de apoios, generosidade de várias pessoas, e nós gostaríamos de agradecer ao Departamento de Linguística e Filologia da Universidade Federal do Rio de Janeiro, as pessoas da professora Maria Carlota Rosa e da professora Miriam Leme, e do professor Sérgio Ferreira, da COP da Universidade Federal do Rio de Janeiro, ao CNPq, ao Departamento de Linguística da Faculdade de Filosofia desta universidade, a pessoa da professora Maria Cristina Altman, à editora escrita, ao Jornal da Tarde e a várias outras pessoas, as quais eu gostaria de expressar o agradecimento que nos proporciona esse momento excepcional para as festividades do IA e um momento excepcional também para a Universidade de São Paulo. Nós teremos agora a palavra da professora Marilena Chauí, que fará uma breve apresentação do professor Chomsky e acho que minha vida, primeiro, desculpa, pessoal. Teremos a palavra do professor Francis Robert, do Departamento de Linguística dessa universidade, e que está aqui representando o magnífico reitor. A palavra. Eu citei na palavra magnífico, porque imaginando se será traduzido e achar muito engraçado que no Brasil nós tenhamos ainda essas palavras tão compostas.
Essas palavras compostas são, na verdade, uma herança do Império Bizantino. Os títulos de nobreza eram exatamente assim: ilustríssimo, excelentíssimo e magnífico. Magnífico acho que era o equivalente a duque, mais ou menos, né? E os comuns mortais, que hoje são ilustríssimos, eram barões. Era magnífico. Professor Chomsky and dear colleagues, Professor Flávio Fava de Moraes, the president of this university, has asked the Faculty of Philosophy, Letters and Human Sciences to represent him at this event. Those of you who attended the morning lecture will inevitably get a déjà vu feeling in my words, but it's a bit inevitable under the circumstances, as you may realize. There are also those of you who, for several reasons, were not able to share with us the morning work, and it is primarily to them I now address myself. On behalf of the University of Sao Paulo, I have the honor of welcoming Professor Chomsky as our guest speaker this afternoon. Professor Chomsky, as you well know, is one of the foremost linguists of our time, for a number of reasons, but perhaps, above all, for the essential questions he has challenged us with concerning the nature of language, that is to say, concerning one of the most vital common heritages of mankind, taken by many as a distinctive feature which defines human beings as such. But Professor Chomsky has also given major contributions in what, I would dare to say only apparently, is a different field of investigation and action. His concern with the theories and practices of democracy, with a totalitarian undercurrent which remained vigorous and perhaps growingly so, within the framework of so-called Western democracy, and particularly within the very seat of the empire, the United States of America and its Pax Americana. For those of us who live and labor in the outskirts of the empire, this is a double challenge. Democracy the freedom of the individual and the freedom of the communities are continuously subject to the risk of manipulation of false consensus, in part imposed from abroad, from the centre, but also in part reproduced and restated within the textures of our own social and political institutions. A double challenge results in a twofold interest and concern. Therefore, Professor Chomsky, you can count on a redoubled interest on our part in listening to your views on this subject. Thank you.
Well, of course, I'm not introducing Professor Chomsky. What I'll say are some words in praise of Professor Chomsky and to thank him to be here with us. Para as pessoas da minha geração, ter o professor Chomsky conosco é uma honra. Para os mais jovens, ter o professor Chomsky é um privilégio de aprendizagem, um privilégio de descoberta. A maior parte dos acadêmicos julga que, dando uma formação séria aos seus estudantes e dando alguma contribuição digna ao seu campo de trabalho, cumpriu as finalidades estabelecidas. Alguns outros são mais exigentes e eles consideram que é preciso uma contribuição maior, uma revolução teórica no campo em que eles trabalham. Quando eles realizam essa revolução teórica, eles consideram que fizeram jus e pagaram o seu tributo ao gênero humano. Mas há uns poucos, muito poucos, que consideram que a seriedade do trabalho acadêmico e que a revolução no campo teórico não são suficientes. Que, em nome de certos princípios e de certos valores que dão sentido à existência humana, é preciso ir além. É preciso uma luta e uma coragem para além dessa contribuição acadêmica e teórica. E entre esses pouquíssimos está o professor Chomsky. E é por isso que é um privilégio poder estar com ele. O professor Chomsky é aquele que fez as primeiras denúncias da guerra do Vietnã antes da grande escala. Foi aquele que fez as primeiras críticas e as primeiras denúncias a respeito do Burundi antes que a ONU tomasse conhecimento e que a mídia se apropriasse disso. O professor Chomsky foi aquele que esteve presente, está presente em todas as lutas por direitos sociais e direitos civis, não só no seu país, mas em outros países. O professor Chomsky é aquele que denunciou o totalitarismo stalinista e o que acontecia nos países do antigo Pacto de Varsóvia. Ele denuncia e critica a política do seu governo, a política do Departamento de Estado norte-americano em relação aos países do terceiro mundo. Ele critica com outros intelectuais de esquerda, mas ele de uma maneira muito mais precisa e rigorosa, a política do Departamento de Estado americano e a do Estado de Israel no Oriente Médio. Trata-se, portanto, de um intelectual que não é apenas crítico do que está presente, mas é um intelectual, um homem de esquerda, que tem a coragem de afrontar o establishment, e não qualquer establishment. O establishment do país que pretende ser o governante da nova ordem mundial. Mas, além disso, o professor Chomsky toma pé agora na medida em que ele se voltou sempre numa luta contra a desigualdade econômica e social, a violência, a injustiça e a miséria, o poder dos ricos sobre os pobres. Ele trata agora uma maneira impiedosa, necessária, de uma crítica da orgia neoliberal, da crença de uma racionalidade do mercado, que nós sabemos que é a mais absoluta irracionalidade, geradora não de uma nova ordem mundial, mas da manutenção do poderio dos ricos sobre os pobres, da exploração, da exclusão, da discriminação e da disseminação de todas as formas de violência. E, nesse sentido, ele toma a pé na questão da democracia. Não só porque a democracia deixou de ser a criação e garantia de direitos, mas porque a democracia se tornou um instrumento dócil, não só nas mãos de governos que interessam os seus fundos públicos para políticas desconhecidas da sociedade, mas também porque empregam todos os meios ligados ao mercado da publicidade, a toda a transformação da democracia em um grande espetáculo publicitário despolitizado. É nessa luta, portanto, que o professor Chomsky é, para nós todos, exemplar. Eu diria também que eu creio que nós devemos a Chomsky algo ainda mais profundo. Ser um intelectual exemplar, porque ele não cedeu jamais ao fascínio do poder e da mídia. Não cedeu jamais às modas intelectuais, econômicas e políticas. Não tendo jamais pensado em dizer a nós, ou a quem quer que seja, que nós podemos esquecer o que um dia ele escreveu. Como eu sou, dedicado amante do século XVII, eu gostaria de endereçar a ele as palavras de um filósofo do século XVII que lutou pela liberdade contra todas as formas da superstição e da tirania. Spinoza, que disse, e essas palavras são dedicadas ao professor Chomsky, aquele que vive sob a direção da razão, esforça-se tanto quanto pode para retribuir o ódio, a cólera e o desdém que lhe dedicam com dignidade. O homem livre, que vive entre os ignorantes, esforça-se tanto quanto pode para evitar os favores deles. E somente os seres humanos livres são gratos uns aos outros. Thank you very much.
A decent democratic society should be based on the principle of consent of the governed. That idea has won general acceptance, but it can be challenged as both too strong and too weak. Too strong because it suggests that people must be governed and controlled. Too weak because even the most brutal rulers require some measure of consent of the governed, and generally obtained, not only by force. I'm interested here in how the more free and more democratic societies have dealt with these issues. Over the years, popular forces have sought to gain a larger share in managing their affairs, with some successes, alongside of many defeats. Meanwhile, an instructive body of thought has been developed to justify elite resistance to democracy. And those who want to understand the past and also to shape the future would do well to pay careful attention not only to practice, but also to the doctrinal framework that supports it. These issues were addressed 250 years ago by David Hume in classic work, not quite as far back as the quote you just heard, but almost. Hume was intrigued by the easiness with which the many are governed by the few, the implicit submission with which men resign their fate to their rulers. This he found surprising, because force is always on the side of the governed. If people would realize that, they would rise up and overthrow the masters. He concluded that government is founded on control of opinion, a principle that extends to the most despotic and most military governments, as well as the most free and most popular. Hume surely underestimated the effectiveness of brute force. A more accurate version is that the more free and popular a government, the more it becomes necessary to rely on control of opinion to ensure submission to the rulers. That people must submit is taken for granted pretty much across the spectrum. In a democracy, the governed have the right to consent, but nothing more than that. In the terminology of modern progressive thought, the population may be spectators, but not participants, apart from occasional choices among leaders representing authentic power. That is the political arena. The general population must be excluded entirely from the economic arena, where what happens in society is largely determined. Here, the public is to have no role, according to prevailing democratic theory. These assumptions have been challenged throughout history, but the issues have taken on particular force since the first modern democratic revolution in 17th century England. The turmoil of those times is often depicted as a conflict between king and parliament, but as is often true, a good part of the population did not want to be governed by either of the contestants for power, but by countrymen like ourselves that know our wants, so their pamphlets declared, not by knights and gentlemen who do not know the people's sores and will but oppress us. Such ideas greatly distressed the men of best quality, as they called themselves, the responsible men in modern terminology. They were prepared to grant the people rights, but within limits, and on the principle that by the people, we do not mean the confused and ignorant rabble, they explained. But how is that fundamental principle of social life to be reconciled with the doctrine of consent of the governed, which was not so easy to suppress by that time? A solution to the problem was proposed by Hume's contemporary, Francis Hutcheson, who was a distinguished moral philosopher. He argued that the principle of consent of the governed is not violated when the rulers impose plans that are rejected by the public, if later on the stupid and prejudiced masses will heartily consent to what we have done in their name. We can adopt the principle of consent without consent. It's the term that was used later by well-known North American sociologist Franklin Henry Giddings. Hutcheson was concerned with control of the rabble at home, Giddings with enforcing order abroad. He was writing about the Philippines, which the United States Army was liberating at the time, also liberating several 100,000 souls from life's sorrows, or as the press put it, slaughtering the natives in English fashion so that the misguided creatures who resist us will at least respect our arms and later come to recognize that we wish them liberty and happiness. To explain all of this in properly civilized tones, Giddings devised his concept of consent without consent. For Giddings, if in later years the conquered people see and admit that the disputed relation was for the highest interest, it may reasonably be held that authority has been imposed with the consent of the governed, as when a parent prevents a child from running into a busy street. These explanations capture the real meaning of the doctrine of consent of the government. The people must submit to their rulers, and it is enough if they give consent without consent. Within a tyrannical state or in foreign domains, force may be used. When the resources of violence are limited, the consent of the governed must be obtained by the devices that are called manufacture of consent by progressive and liberal opinion. Liberal in the United States hemisphere. The enormous public relations industry, from its origins early in this century, has been dedicated to the control of the public mind as business leaders described the task. They warned, I'm quoting, they warned of the hazard facing industrialists in the newly realized political power of the masses and the need to wage and win the everlasting battle for the minds of men and indoctrinate citizens with the capitalist story until they are able to play back the story with remarkable fidelity. And they acted on their words. It's surely one of the central themes of modern history. The fact that the public relations industry has its roots in major centers in the country that is most free is exactly what we should expect with a proper understanding of Hume's maxim. A few years after Hume and Hutcheson wrote, the problem caused by the rabble in England spread to the rebelling colonies of North America, and the founding fathers of American democracy repeated the sentiments of the British men of best quality in almost the same words. As one put it, when I mention republic, I mean to include only the rational part of it. The ignorant vulgar are as unfit to judge of the modes of government as they are unable to manage its reins. The people are a great beast that must be tamed, as colleague Alexander Hamilton declared. Rebellious and independent farmers had been taught, sometimes by force, that the ideals of the revolutionary pamphlets were not to be taken too seriously. The common people were to be represented not by countrymen like themselves, who know the people's sores, but by gentry, merchants, lawyers, and other responsible men who can be trusted to defend privilege. The reigning doctrines were expressed clearly by the President of the Constitutional Convention and the first Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, John Jay, who stated that the people who own the country ought to govern. One issue remained to be settled: who owns the country? That question was answered by the rise of private corporations and the institutional structure devised to protect and support them, although it remains a difficult task to compel the public to keep to the spectator role. The United States is surely the most important case to study if we hope to understand the world of today and tomorrow. One reason is its incomparable power. Another is its stable democratic institutions. Furthermore, the United States was as close to a tabula rasa as one can find. America can be as happy as she pleases, Tom Paine remarked in 1776. She has a blank sheet to write upon. The indigenous societies were largely eliminated. The United States also has little residue of earlier European structures. It's one reason for the relative weakness of the social contract and of support systems, which often had their roots in pre-capitalist institutions. And to an unusual extent, the socio-political order was consciously designed. In studying history, one cannot construct experiments, of course, but the United States is as close to the ideal case of state capitalist democracy as can be found. The main designer, furthermore, was an astute political thinker, James Madison. In the debates on the Constitution, Madison pointed out that if elections in England were open to all classes of people, the property of landed proprietors would be insecure. An agrarian law would soon take place, he said, giving land to the landlords. And the constitutional system must be designed to prevent such injustice and, in his words, secure the permanent interests of the country, which are property rights. The primary responsibility of government is to protect the minority of the opulent against the majority, Madison declared. And that has been the guiding principle of the democratic system from its origins until today. I should say I'm quoting from the Constitutional Convention, but one is not taught these things in school. Madison foresaw that the threat of democracy was likely to become more severe over time because of the increase in the proportion of those who will labor under all the hardships of life and secretly sigh for a more equal distribution of its blessings. They might gain influence, Madison feared. He was concerned by the symptoms of a leveling spirit that had already appeared, and he warned of the future danger if the right to vote would place power over property in hands without a share in it. Those without property or the hope of acquiring it cannot be expected to sympathize sufficiently with its rights, Madison explained. His solution was to keep political power in the hands of those who, in his words, come from and represent the wealth of the nation, the more capable set of men, with the general public fragmented and disorganized. The problem also arises abroad, of course, and we learn a lot about really existing democratic theory by seeing how this problem is perceived, particularly in secret internal documents where leaders can be more frank and open. So take the example of Latin America. Latin American elites are like children. Secretary of State John Foster Dulles informed the National Security Council 40 years ago, all in secret. Worse still, the United States is hopelessly behind the Soviets in developing controls over the minds and emotions of unsophisticated people. Dulles and President Eisenhower expressed their concern over the communist ability to get control of mass movements, an ability that we have no capacity to duplicate. The poor people are the ones they appeal to, and they have always wanted to plunder the rich. In other words, we find it hard to induce people to accept our doctrine that the rich should plunder the poor. Kind of public relations problem, hard to solve. The Kennedy administration faced the problem by shifting the mission of the Latin American military from hemispheric defense to internal security. Remember what that means. And it was a decision with fateful consequences, beginning with the military coup in Brazil. The military had been seen in Washington as what they called an island of sanity in Brazil, and the coup was welcomed by Kennedy's ambassador, Lincoln Gordon, as a democratic rebellion. It is the single most decisive victory of freedom in the mid-20th century, he said. Gordon is a former Harvard University economist, and he added that the victory of freedom should create a greatly improved climate for private investments. Give some further insight into the meanings of the term freedom and democracy. 2 years later, Defense Secretary Robert McNamara informed his associates that United States policies toward the Latin American military have on the whole been effective in attaining the goals set for them. These policies, he said, have improved internal security capabilities and established predominant United States military influence. The Latin American military understand their tasks and are equipped to pursue them thanks to Kennedy's programs of military aid and training. These tasks include the overthrow of civilian governments whenever, in the judgment of the military, the conduct of these leaders is injurious to the welfare of the nation. Such actions by the military are necessary in the Latin American cultural environment, the Kennedy intellectuals explained. It's actually a discussion between McNamara and McGeorge Bundy, who was the former dean of Harvard. Another magnificent person. And we can be confident that these tasks will be carried out properly now that the military have gained an understanding of and orientation towards United States objectives. That assures a proper outcome to the revolutionary struggle for power among major groups which constitute the present class structure in Latin America, an outcome that will protect private United States investment and trade, the economic route that is at the heart of United States political interest in Latin America. These are secret documents, in this case of Kennedy liberalism. Public discourse is naturally quite different. If we keep to it, we will understand little about the true meaning of democracy or about the global order of the past years and the future as well, since the same hands hold the reins. The pattern continues today. The champion human rights violator in the hemisphere is Colombia, also the leading recipient of U.S. military aid and training in recent years. The pretext is drug war, but that is a myth, as regularly reported by major human rights groups, the church, and others who have investigated the shocking record of atrocities and the close links between the narco-traffickers, the landowners, the military, and their paramilitary associates. State terror has devastated popular organizations and virtually destroyed the one independent political party by assassination of thousands of activists, including presidential candidates, mayors, and others. Nonetheless, Colombia is hailed as a stable democracy, revealing again what is meant by democracy. Just a few days ago, I received a private message from a friend, a North American lawyer, who was working in Colombia with a church-based human rights group, who was in hiding in Bogota because he had witnessed personally the assassination of a human rights activist by one of the paramilitary elements who worked with the state security forces. And since he had witnessed the atrocity, his own life was in danger, so he was in hiding, and he had to flee Colombia. And a few days later, I got a phone call from him. He managed to get back to the United States. But these are regular practices. A glimpse of reality from another point of view is provided by the recent NAFTA agreement. Incidentally, hardly a free trade agreement. Its highly protectionist features are largely an attempt to block East Asian and European competitors. It's no longer possible to offer happy predictions about NAFTA and its benefits for all. So advocates now concede that the underlying purpose of NAFTA was not to promote trade, but to cement Mexico's economic reforms. Quoting Foreign Affairs, the semi-official journal of Foreign Affairs. The goal, continuing to quote, the goal of NAFTA was to lock Mexico into the reforms that had made it an economic miracle for investors from the United States and the Mexican rich, while the population sank into misery. Locking Mexico into these reforms, it is hoped, will deflect the danger that was detected by a Latin American strategy development workshop in Washington in 1990, quoting them, that a democracy opening in Mexico could test the special relationship by bringing into office a government more interested in challenging the United States on economic and nationalist grounds. So democracy will be less threatening if the policy choices are closed. That's one aspect of what's called minimizing the state, hence maximizing private power and ensuring that what democratic forms remain has very little function. Responsible men who have to deal with the children of the world face a hard task, and it is therefore not surprising that Washington's impulse to promote democracy is generally ineffective and often limited to rhetoric. I'm again quoting from the major scholarly study of Washington's crusade for democracy during the Reagan years by Thomas Carruthers, who writes with an insider's perspective. He worked on these programs in Reagan's State Department, so he's giving a sympathetic view. Carruthers regards the programs as sincere, although largely a failure. He notes further that the failure was systematic. Where Washington's influence was least in the southern part of the hemisphere, there was real progress toward democracy, which the Reagan administration generally opposed, later taking credit for it when the process proved irresistible. Where Washington's influence was greatest, closer to home, progress was least. In his own words, the United States sought to maintain the basic order of quite undemocratic societies and to avoid populist-based change. Like its predecessors, the Reagan administration adopted pro-democracy policies as a means of relieving pressure for more radical change, but inevitably sought only limited top-down forms of democratic change that did not risk upsetting the traditional structures of power with which the United States has long been allied. My comments on the Madisonian roots of the prevailing concepts of democracy was unfair in an important respect. Like Adam Smith and other founders of classical liberalism, Madison was pre-capitalist and anti-capitalist in spirit. He expected that the rulers would be what he called enlightened statesmen and benevolent philosophers, whose wisdom may best discern the true interests of their country. They would guard the true interests of the country against the mischiefs of democratic majorities, but with enlightenment and benevolence. Madison soon learned differently, as the opulent minority proceeded to use their newly found power, much as Adam Smith had described a few years earlier. They were intent on pursuing what Smith called the vile maxim of the masters, all for ourselves and nothing for other people. By 1792, Madison warned that the rising developmental capitalist state was substituting the motive of private interest in place of a public duty, leading to a real domination of the few under an apparent liberty of the many. He deplored the daring depravity of the time. As private powers become the Praetorian band of the government, at once its tools and its tyrant, bribed by its largesses and overawing it by its clamors and combinations. They cast over society the shadow that we call politics, as John Dewey later commented. One of the major 20th century philosophers and a leading figure of North American liberalism, Dewey emphasized that talk of democracy has little content when big business rules the life of the country through its control of the means of production, exchange, publicity, transportation, and communication, reinforced by command of the press agents, and other means of publicity and propaganda. Dewey held further that in a free and democratic society, workers must be the masters of their own industrial fate, not tools rented by employers. These are ideas that trace back to classical liberalism and to the Enlightenment and have constantly reappeared in popular struggle in the United States as elsewhere, including the first year. There have been many changes in the past 200 years, but Madison's words of warning have only become more appropriate, taking new meaning with the establishment of great private tyrannies that were granted extraordinary powers early in this century, primarily by the courts. They receive ample largesses from the states that they largely dominate, remaining both tools and tyrants in Madison's phrase, and they have gained substantial control over the domestic and international economy, as well as the informational and doctrinal systems. Let's now turn to the doctrines that have been crafted to impose the modern forms of political democracy. They're expressed quite accurately in an important manual of the public relations industry by one of its leading figures, Edward Bernays. He opens by writing, quoting, that the conscious and intelligent manipulation of the organized habits and opinions of the masses is an important element in democratic society. To carry out this essential task, the intelligent minorities must make use of propaganda continuously and systematically, because they alone understand the mental processes and social patterns of the masses, and they can hold the wires which control the public mind. Therefore, our society has consented to permit free competition to be organized by leadership and propaganda. Notice that's another case of consent without consent. Propaganda provides the leadership with a mechanism to mold the mind of the masses so that they will throw their newly gained strength in the desired direction. The leadership can regiment the public mind every bit as much as an army regiments the bodies of its soldiers. This process of engineering consent is the very essence of the democratic process that Bernays wrote shortly before he was honored for his contributions by the American Psychological Association in 1949. Bernays was a good New Deal liberal. He had developed his skills in Woodrow Wilson's propaganda committee, the Committee on Public Information. That was the first official U.S. state propaganda agency. He wrote that it was the astounding success of propaganda during World War I that opened the eyes of the intelligent few in all departments of life to the possibilities of regimenting the public mind. He explained this in his public relations manual, which was honestly entitled Propaganda. The intelligent few were perhaps unaware that their astounding success relied in no small part on propaganda fabrications about Hun atrocities that were provided to them by the British Ministry of Information, which secretly defined its task as to direct the thought of most of the world. All of this is good Wilsonian doctrine, known as Wilsonian idealism in political theory. Wilson's own view was that an elite of gentlemen with elevated ideals is needed to preserve stability and righteousness. It's the intelligent minority of responsible men who must control decision-making. Another veteran of the propaganda committee, Walter Lippmann, explained in his influential essays on democracy. Lippmann was also the most respected figure in North American journalism and a noted commentator on public affairs for half a century. The intelligent minority are a specialized class who are responsible for setting policy and for the formation of a sound public opinion, Lippmann elaborated. They must be free from interference by the general public, who are ignorant and meddlesome outsiders. The public must be put in its place, Lippmann continued. Their function is to be spectators of action, not participants, apart from periodic electoral exercises when they choose among the specialized class. Leaders must be free to operate in technocratic insulation to borrow the current World Bank terminology, basic thesis of neoliberalism, illustrating how it is, in effect, a form of totalitarianism and intended to be. In the Encyclopedia of the Social Sciences, Harold Lasswell, who's one of the founders of modern political science, warned that the intelligent few must recognize, quoting him, must recognize the ignorance and stupidity of the masses and not succumb to democratic dogmatisms about men being the best judges of their own interests. They are not the best judges. We are. The masses must be controlled for their own good, and in more democratic societies where force is unavailable, social managers must turn to a whole new technique of control, largely through propaganda, Lasswell explained. Notice that this is all good Leninist doctrine, and the similarity between progressive democratic theory and Marxism-Leninism is rather striking. Something that Bakunin had predicted long before. It is the only prediction of the social sciences that has ever come true, and ought to be studied for that reason alone. With a proper understanding of the concept of consent, we can see that implementation of the business agenda over the objections of the general public is with the consent of the government, a form of consent without consent. That's actually a fair description of what has been happening in the United States. There's often a gap between public preferences and public policy. In recent years, that gap has become substantial, and a comparison sheds further light on the functioning of the democratic system in the best case. More than 80% of the public in the United States think that the government is run for the benefit of the few and the special interests, not the people. That's up from about 50% in earlier years. Over 80% believe that the economic system is inherently unfair, and that working people have too little say in what goes on in the country. More than 70% feel that business has gained too much power over too many aspects of American life. And by almost 20-1, the public believe that corporations should sometimes sacrifice some profit for the sake of making things better for their workers and communities. Public attitudes remain stubbornly social democratic in important respects, as they did through the Reagan years, contrary to a good deal of mythology. But we should also note that these attitudes fall far short of the ideas that animated the democratic revolutions. Working people of 19th century North America did not plead with their rulers to be more benevolent. Rather, they denied their right to rule. Those who work in the mills should own them, the labor press demanded, upholding the ideals of the American Revolution as the dangerous rabble understood them, incidentally without the dubious aid of radical intellectuals. The 1994 congressional election is a revealing example of the gap between rhetoric and fact. In the press, it was called a political earthquake, a landslide victory, a triumph of conservatism that reflects the continuing drift to the right as voters gave an overwhelming popular mandate to Newt Gingrich's ultra-right army, who promised to get the government off our backs and bring back the happy days when the free market ran. Turning to the facts, the landslide victory was won with barely over half the votes cast, about 20% of the electorate, figures that hardly differ from 2 years earlier when Democrats won. Among the 20% who voted for the triumph of conservatism, 1 out of 6 described the outcome as an affirmation of the Republican agenda. Of the minority who voted at all, only 1 out of 4 had even heard of the Contract with America, which presented that agenda. And when informed, the population opposed virtually all of it by large majorities. About 60% of the population wanted social spending increase. A year later, 80% held that the federal government must protect the most vulnerable in society, especially the poor and the elderly, by guaranteeing minimum living standards and providing social benefits. 80 to 90% of Americans support federal guarantees of public assistance for those who cannot work, unemployment insurance, subsidized prescription drugs, nursing home care for the elderly, a minimum level of health care, and Social Security. 3/4 support federally guaranteed child care for low-income working mothers. The resilience of such attitudes is particularly striking in the light of the unremitting propaganda assault to persuade the public that they hold radically different views. From the beginning, it has been clear from the polls that the stories about the conservative landslide were untrue, and now the fraud is quietly conceded. The polling specialist of the Gingrich Republicans explained recently that when he reported that most people supported the contract with America, what he meant was that they liked the slogans that were used for packaging. For example, his studies showed that the public opposes dismantling the health system, but wants to preserve, protect, and strengthen it for the next generation. So dismantling is packaged as a solution that preserves and protects the health system. And so it goes through the list. All of this is very natural in a society that is to an unusual extent business run with huge expenditures on marketing. About $1 trillion a year. That's 1/6 of gross domestic product, and mostly tax deductible, so that people pay for the privilege of being subjected to manipulation of their attitudes and behavior. But the great beast is hard to tame. Repeatedly it has been thought that the problem has been solved, and that the end of history has been reached in a kind of utopia of the masters. One classic moment was at the origins of neoliberal doctrine in the early 19th century, when Ricardo and Malthus and other great figures of classical economics announced that the new science had proven, with the certainty of Newton's laws, that we only harm the poor by trying to help them, and that the best gift we can offer the suffering masses is to free them from the delusion that they have a right to live. The new science proved that people have no rights beyond what they can obtain in the unregulated labor market. By the 1830s, it seemed that the doctrines had won the day in England. With the triumph of right thinking at the service of British manufacturing and financial interests, the people of England were forced into the paths of the utopian experiment Karl Polanyi later wrote in classic work. The most ruthless act of social reform in all of history, which crushed multitudes of lives. But an unanticipated problem arose. The stupid masses began to draw the conclusion that if we have no right to live, you have no right to rule. The British Army had to cope with riots and disorders, and soon an even greater threat took shape as workers began to organize, demanding factory laws and social legislation to protect them from the brutal neoliberal experiment, and going well beyond. The science, which is fortunately flexible, took new form as elite opinion shifted in response to uncontrollable popular forces, discovering that the right to live had to be preserved under a social contract of some sort. Later in the 19th century, it seemed to many that order had been restored, although a few dissented. The famous artist William Morris outraged respectable opinion by declaring himself a socialist in a talk at Oxford University. He recognized that it is the received opinion that the competitive system, everyone looks out for themselves, is the last system of economy that the world will see, that it is perfection, and therefore finality has been reached in it. But if history really is at an end, he continued, then civilization will die, and this he refused to believe, despite the confident proclamations of the most learned men. And he was right, as popular struggle demonstrated. In the United States, too, the gay 90s, as they were called a century ago, were hailed as perfection and finality. And by the roaring 20s, it was confidently assumed that labor had been crushed for good, the utopia of the masters achieved, in a most undemocratic America that was created over the workers' protests. Yale University historian David Montgomery comments. But once again, the celebration was premature. Within a few years, the great beast once again escaped its cage, and even the United States, the business-run society par excellence, was forced by popular struggle to grant rights that had been won long ago in far more autocratic societies. Immediately after World War II, business launched a huge propaganda offensive to regain what it had lost. By the late 1950s, it was widely assumed that the goal had been achieved. We had reached the end of ideology, Harvard sociologist Daniel Bell wrote. A few years earlier, as an editor of the leading business journal Fortune, he had reported what he called the staggering scale of business propaganda campaigns designed to overcome the social democratic attitudes that persisted into the post-war years. But again, the celebration was premature. Events of the 1960s showed that the great beast was still on the prowl, once again arousing the fear of democracy among responsible men. The Trilateral Commission, founded by David Rockefeller in 1973, devoted its first major study to what it called the crisis of democracy throughout the West, as large sectors of the population sought to enter the public arena. The naive might think of that as a step toward democracy, but the Commission understood that it was what they called excessive democracy. They hoped to restore the days when Truman had been able to govern the country with the cooperation of a relatively small number of Wall Street lawyers and bankers, as the North American rapporteur commented, respected Harvard professor. That was proper moderation in democracy. Of particular concern to the Commission were the failures of what it called the institutions responsible for the indoctrination of the young, the schools, the universities, and the churches. And the Commission proposed means to restore discipline and to return the general public to passivity and obedience, overcoming the crisis of democracy. The Commission represents the more liberal internationalist sectors of power and intellectual life in the United States, Europe, and Japan. The Carter administration was largely drawn from its ranks, almost entirely, in fact. The right wing takes a much harsher line. From the 1970s, changes in the international economy put new weapons into the hands of the masters, enabling them to chip away at the hated social contract that had been won by the popular struggle. The political spectrum in the United States, always very narrow, reduced to near invisibility. A few months after Bill Clinton took office, the lead story in the Wall Street Journal expressed its pleasure that on issue after issue, Mr. Clinton and his administration come down on the same side as corporate America, eliciting cheers from heads of major corporations who were delighted that we're getting along much better with this administration than we did with previous ones, one put it. A year later, business leaders found they could do even better. And by September 1995, Business Week reported that the new Congress represents a milestone for business. Never before have so many goodies been showered so enthusiastically on America's entrepreneurs. In the November 1996 elections, both candidates were moderate Republicans and longtime government insiders, candidates of the business world. The campaign was one of historic dullness, the business press reported. Polls showed that public interest had declined even below the previous low levels, despite record-breaking spending, and that voters disliked both candidates and expected little from either of them. So there is large-scale discontent with the workings of the democratic system. A similar phenomenon has been reported in Latin America, and although conditions are quite different, some of the reasons are the same. Argentine political scientist Porfirio Barón has stressed the fact that in Latin America, the democratic process was established together with neoliberal economic reforms, which have been a disaster for most people. The introduction of similar programs in the richest country of the world have had similar effects. When more than 80% of the population feel that the democratic system is a sham and that the economy is inherently unfair, the consent of the governed is going to be very shallow. It's worth remembering that we've been through all of this before. The end of history, perfection, finality have often been proclaimed, always falsely. And with all the sordid continuities, an optimistic soul can discern slow progress, realistically, I think. In the advanced industrial countries, and often elsewhere too, popular struggles can start from a higher plane and with greater expectations than those of the gay 90s and the roaring 20s, or even 30 years ago. And international solidarity can take new and more constructive forms as the great majority of the people of the world come to understand that their interests are pretty much the same and can be advanced by working together. There's no more reason now than there has ever been to believe that we are constrained by mysterious and unknown social laws, not simply by decisions that are made within institutions that are subject to human will, human institutions that have to face the test of legitimacy, and if they do not meet it, can be replaced by others that are more free and more just, as often in the past.
A questão de comportamento eleitoral. E numa delas, se pergunta, no caso dos Estados Unidos, como é que o senhor avalia que menos de 50% dos eleitores elegíveis vota nas eleições presidenciais? E no caso do Brasil, como é que o senhor avalia a guinada à direita nas eleições que acabam de acontecer?
Well, in the United States, voting is not compulsory, and it has been declining steadily right through this century. If you look at the statistics, in 1924, that was the lowest level, but that's misleading. 1924 was right after women were allowed to vote, and it took a couple of years before women started to vote. So the fact of the matter is that voting has been declining steadily. It's now reached its lowest point ever The 1996 elections didn't even reach 50%. Congressional elections are even lower, they're over a third. The reason is pretty straightforward. When people feel, when 80% of the population thinks that the government is run for the few and the special interests, not for the people, why vote? Why vote for one or another representative of the special interests who own the place and run the world? The business press agrees that both candidates are candidates of the business world, and the population agrees too. Now, there are some differences. For historical reasons, the two parties have different constituencies. So, for example, just take, say, income. If you rank people on income level, then above a certain income, the majority votes Republican, and below that income, the majority votes Democratic. That's pretty stable. The point varies, and you can sort of predict the outcome of the election by asking exactly where the point is. In the last election, it was about $100,000 a year. Above that, the majority voted Republican, and below that, the majority voted Democratic. But these are slight tendencies. Women tend to vote Democratic. Blacks and other ethnic minorities tend to vote Democratic. Corporate executives tend to vote Republican. So these are, again, tendencies. Basically, they're both candidates in the business world, and everybody knows it, and most people don't see much point in voting. Actually, if you look at actual voting, it also correlates quite well with wealth. The wealthier you are, the more you vote, because these little differences make more difference to you. If the whole population voted, it would be a Democratic majority by a large margin. But poorer people usually don't bother. Too much trouble, it doesn't mean anything anyway, so they don't vote. So I think it's easy to explain. As for the shift to the right in Brazil, I mean, pretentious for me to try to tell you what's going on in Brazil, and I won't. But I'm very suspicious about such things. You have to ask yourself what people are voting for. What realistic options do they see before them? So, for example, if you vote for the left, and you know that means that all the money is going to flee out of the country because rich people own the country and they're going to send it to New York and London if they don't like what's happening, then you get consent without consent to the right. Unrealistic ground, because maybe you'll be harmed even more. Since the rich own the place and the state serves them, if they don't like what's happening, they'll just put their money somewhere else, as they started to do in the early 1980s. That's why we have a debt crisis. You wouldn't have one if rich people were compelled to keep their money here as they are in East Asia. But a person living in a, say, favela who can think things through may well decide the most realistic thing is just let the rich people run, because we don't have any choices anyway, as long as they have control over the basic levers of power. Maybe, but question for you to ask.
Bom, a outra pergunta é vou reunir três questões numa só. Primeiro, se é uma coincidência que o senhor e o Prêmio Nobel Ramos Horta do Timor esteve no Brasil ao mesmo tempo, como é que o senhor vê o problema do movimento do sem terra no Brasil, e se é possível uma comparação entre NAFTA e Mercosul.
Together on this for 20 years, and I was recently in Australia at his invitation. He's based really the invitation of the East Timor refugees committee, the big refugee community in Australia. And I was delighted to see him here yesterday, but that was just coincidence. Unless there's some higher planning that I'm not aware of. On the landless workers, they're the people who, remember, James Madison was worried about 100 years ago. He was worried that in England, he was thinking of the most democratic society of that day, if you allowed people freedom, if you allowed them to vote, they would call for a change and for a rare, what we nowadays call agrarian reform, land to the landless. And people are still fighting for it. Brazil is a particularly obscene case, not only because of the extraordinary inequality, but because there's plenty of land. You know that better than I do. There's plenty of land available, and what land is used is overwhelmingly in the hands of very few people, and presumably mostly foreign. So this is a terrible scandal. The landless workers are at the forefront of struggle for elementary justice, I would think. As for NAFTA and Mercosur, they're not really the same. NAFTA is a U.S.-run agreement designed to integrate Canada and Mexico within the United States, basically, and to keep out Asian and European competitors, and to free up operations for U.S.-based corporations within the North American region. It's designed, as I quoted, I didn't make it up, it's quoting from high-level documents, it's designed to prevent the threat of democracy in Mexico. In case there should ever be democracy in Mexico, God forbid, it won't be able to do anything because the public arena will have shrunk and they'll be locked into these so-called reforms by a treaty. It's also designed to destroy the welfare state in Canada, and in fact it's having that effect. Canada is kind of an unpleasant phenomenon for the United States. The United States is very nationalistic and internal. If any of you have lived there, you know that the world isn't covered in the press. Most people don't know where Canada is. But it's still the fact that Canada has a healthcare system that works, social services work, and so on. That's sort of embarrassing. So the best thing to do is destroy it. And NAFTA is in part designed to have that. Now that Mercosur is quite a different story. That goes back to the origins of the history of Latin America, much better than I do. But as you know, Paul, early in the colonial period, the relationships within Latin America were more or less broken, and for all kinds of reasons. The countries were linked independently to European, later North American sources. So the natural relationships internal to Latin America never really developed. And Mercosur is in part an effort to develop somewhere. Of course, the big powers outside are looking very carefully and trying to figure how they can use this for their own interests. So the Japanese, and European, and North American investors have their own plans about how to use it. But you can imagine it being constructed if it's developed independently and for the interests of the local population. Of course, that means that the countries themselves have to be run in a very different way. If they're run by their own rich, as in the past, it will be another disaster for the population.
Há conjunto de perguntas que são ligadas à questão do anarquismo, e uma delas sintetiza a questão. O senhor tem dito que, atualmente, para a manutenção da democracia face ao neoliberalismo, é preciso defender o Estado. Qual é a relação entre isso e os seus ideais anarquistas?
On the surface, it looks like a contradiction. My own views, just to clarify, are that the state is an illegitimate institution of authority and power, and it ought to be dismantled in favor of popular control over workplaces and communities and voluntary associations and so on. So the state, in my view, is illegitimate. That's point number one. Point number two is, in my opinion, we should defend the state. Because right now there's even greater danger. The greater danger is private power, concentrated private power, which isn't at all under public influence. But, however, illegitimacy is not a matter of sort of yes or no. There are degrees of illegitimacy. Like a military dictatorship is more illegitimate than a parliamentary democracy. And slavery is more illegitimate than wage labor, and so on. If you want to live in the real world, you have to be able to make some distinctions. The world is a complicated place. And the state, especially as a parliamentary democracy, is an arena in which the public can have some influence. In fact, as long as private power exists, not much influence, but some. And sometimes that can be rather significant. In fact, that's how a social contract was established. I briefly ran through, but much too briefly ran through what's happened in the last couple hundred years. But the story is essentially the winning of more and more human rights by popular struggle, often making use of the means that are available within the framework of a formal democratic state. They're always resisted. Private power is always going to resist it, but it doesn't mean they have to win. Sometimes they lose. The population wins. So that's why we have things like the healthcare system and some sort of support for poor people and the right of freedom of speech and many other things. I mean, take even freedom of speech. The United States is in fact unusual, I think unique, in the extent to which freedom of speech is protected. That's one of the really good things about the United States. I don't know any other country in which freedom of speech is so guaranteed. And that's very important. There's nothing more important than freedom of speech, so that's a very good thing. How did it get there? Was it a gift from above? No. I mean, in fact, until 1964, pretty recent, until 1964, there were laws of what are called seditious libel. That means it's a crime to attack the state with words. Okay? Actually, almost every country has such a law. And in the United States, it was still on the books until 1964. It wasn't applied very much, but sometimes it was. In 1964, the Supreme Court finally overruled it. Said, no, you can criticize the state freely. Well, that was in the course of the Civil Rights Movement. That was one of the effects of the Freedom Riders fighting in the South, being sometimes killed, not pleasant. But they won a large part of that struggle, and one of the things that they won is the right of freedom of speech. That's important. That's the way all rights have been won. So it's better to have an arena of a public sphere in which people can participate than to have power entirely in the hands of totalitarian institutions. Well, private corporations are totalitarian institutions. They're not under public, they're not accountable to the public. Internally, they're purely hierarchical, a model of a fascist state. Externally, they're not under public control, except to the extent that there are regulatory mechanisms and so on, but that's the state system. The current efforts to minimize the state, to extend, if you minimize the state, you're extending something else. Obviously, what's being extended is private power, which is unaccountable. And that's dangerous. That's going to cut away at the rights that have been won by very hard struggle over many years. And therefore, if you believe in human rights, if you think that poor children ought to have some food to eat, and people ought to have safety in the workplace, and that if you care that the environment will still exist for the next generation, and so on, well, then you want to preserve the public space, even if you think that the state is illegitimate. On the surface, it may seem contradictory, but it's not. It's very consistent. And in my view, a consistent anarchist these days should be working to try to preserve the public arena, which right now has state power, against an even greater danger, namely unaccountable private power. Dismantle the unaccountable private power, and I think it makes good sense to dismantle the state. At any moment in history, there are certain forms of illegitimate authority that ought to be challenged, and other forms that can't be challenged at that state of history and social development. Challenge them all, and we're just handing power over to the worst of the killers and torturers.
O senhor, como membro da comunidade judaica, não está se afastando do judaísmo ao apoiar os palestinos?
That's what you think Jewish issues are. For example, if the Jewish issues are those that are expressed by the prophets, then no. If the Jewish issues are expressed by those who we now call the false prophets, the ones who incidentally were respected at the time of the Bible, the ones who told King Ahab how wonderful he was and who flattered the rich and so on, if those are Jewish issues, yeah, I'm getting away from Jewish issues. Like any other group, Jews were divided. And in fact, we have a historic record of it. A large part of the Bible, when you read it, is about, look, in the period of what's called the prophetic period. I mean, it's hardly historically reconstructed. It's not an actual history. But somehow it is. The prophets were basically the elected. And they divided. Some of them supported the powerful, flattered the rich, and so on. But like always, they were the ones who were respected and admired. There were others who gave geopolitical analysis, who said, look, these policies are going to lead to disaster. They called also for moral principles, like supporting the poor, helping with widows and orphans, and so on. They were treated very nicely. If you read the Bible, you may remember that they're the ones who were in prison, driven into the desert, hated, and so on. Well, if you're in the Jewish community, or anywhere else, you ask yourself, which of those communities do I want to be part of? If you're part of the one that is 1,000 years later honored as the prophets, you ought to protect the rights of Palestinians. Just as whites in South Africa, if they wanted to be, say, whether they were Jewish or Christian or whatever, if what they were committed to was freedom and justice, they supported the rights of blacks in South Africa. In fact, the solution that's being proposed right now in the Middle East is very similar to what South Africa imposed around the 1960s, apartheid and Pakistan. If you think that those are Jewish values, then of course, I don't think those are not the kind of Jewish values I'd like. Not the South African values. Rather different. Incidentally, I don't have the slightest problem explaining any of this in Israel. Where I'm asked to speak about it and write about it. I don't say it's a majority of anything. In fact, I'm way out on the critical side there. But within the spectrum of what at least they consider to be Jewish values, and for others, you just decide for yourself. If Jewish values are those that King Ahab, fine. If Jewish values are those represented by Amos,
conjunto grande de perguntas sobre jornais, rádio, televisão, não pagamento de impostos por jornais e coisas. E é a mídia. Então, como ver o poder da mídia e como lutar contra ele? Qual a relação desses problemas e a ética jornalística?
The ethics of journalism, kind of reminiscent of a famous joke about business ethics. if you go to a business school, they sometimes have courses in business ethics. And it's often said that business ethics is kind of like military music. The ethics of journalism, it depends, it's kind of like Jewish values. If you're a human being in the media, and your ethics are those of a human being, then your goals are to tell the truth, to do your work with integrity, to find out what's important, to inform people, and so on. If you're part of the institution, and you're committed to the institutional values, your ethics are quite different. They're to work for what the institution is laboring to achieve, which certainly isn't what I mentioned before. What's the institution? Well, the media are simply huge corporations. They're part of the corporate sector that owns the country and most of the world, and owns the information system, and runs the public relations industry, and the entertainment industry, and so on. That's the media. They have perfectly obvious interests, namely the ones that I mentioned. They want to control the public mind, to regiment the minds of people as well as the army regiments their bodies, to disperse, to remove them from the public arena, so that the great beast will be in a cage, and to ensure that power remains in the hands of the wealthy without any interference. So they'd like to see people disorganized, dispersed, lack contact with one another, or be subordinated to power. Just an obedient worker and a passive consumer. If your ethics are those of the institution, well, do that. Those are choices that people make within them. And people make them different. There are very good people, close friends in North American media, who are much more cynical about the media than I am. But some of them are quite well-known people, I should say, who recognize their names, see them on television, who try to understand exactly how the system works, much better than I do, because they live in it, and try to find spaces which are there, always, to try to do something, to put things forward that wouldn't be seen elsewhere, and to drop hints that other people can understand, and so on. And sometimes they do quite a good job. I know a lot comes out. How do you deal with this concentration of power the same way as any other country, as any other illegitimate concentration of power? The long-term goal is to dismantle, to democratize the media. And so that's not a very radical plea. You may recall that 7 or 8 years ago, the Brazilian Bishops' Conference, which every year then still selects a topic for the year for reflection and discussion. Around 1988, they picked democratization of the media as the primary thing that Brazilians should be concerned with, quite rightly, because unless you have democratic media, you're not going to have a democratic society. And that's correct. I mean, democratic media means media that are responsive to the public, controlled by the public, in which the public is engaged. Well, that's a long-term goal. And the same is true of the automobile industry, except this one's a lot more important because it's your mind, the most important thing. So either you try to dismantle them or you set up alternatives. There are a lot of opportunities for alternative media. Modern technology, for example, allows new techniques of control, but it also allows new techniques of liberation. They can be used imaginatively, and sometimes are. I've seen some of it while I've been here in Brazil. So you carry out the usual methods of struggle to expand the range of democratic control of clusters and so on. There's no single answer to what you do. Sometimes the best answer is to construct alternative media. Sometimes the best answer is to put pressure on the existing concentrations of power, to which they are somewhat responsive, and try to get them to look out of it. There's no single answer. Depends on the moment, problem, so on.
Há várias perguntas que estão ligadas à questão dos direitos civis nos Estados Unidos. Então, uma pergunta geral, qual é a situação atualmente dos direitos civis, e uma pergunta específica, que diz, eu soube que nos Estados Unidos, que os Estados Unidos é o país com a taxa mais alta de pessoas presas, prisioneiros, e que 1/3 dos afro-americanos, dos homens afro-americanos, está na prisão.
Well, the situation with regard to civil rights in the United States is complicated. There is, in some respects, there is very significant protection for freedom of speech. In other respects, the situation is awful. The comment about imprisonment is exactly correct. If you go back to, say, 1980, the proportion of the population in prison was approximately like that of other industrial societies, sort of toward the high end, but not over the edge. Incidentally, the level of crime is more or less the same. The degree of crime is much higher in the United States. That's certainly true. The crime rates in the United States are at the high end of the industrial societies, but within the bounds of industrial societies, with one exception, and that is killings with guns. That's awfully expected. But that's because of a crazy feature of the United States society. Everybody's running around with guns. So the driver, gets in front of you on the highway and you don't like it, and then kill him. Well, that's one crime that's very high. But on other things, like robbery or acts of violence, or rape, and so on, the United States is sort of toward the high end, but not unusual. The one respect in which it's different is the number of people in prison. Crime has not increased since 1980. In fact, it's probably reduced somewhat. But imprisonment has shot up. During the 1980s, the proportion in prison tripled. It's going up even faster now. The United States in the 1980s passed every other country in the world, because for some time it's been exchanging the world championship with China and Russia, way ahead of South Africa. And every other country. I don't know who's in the lead now. Last time I looked, the United States had a slight lead over China. But it's far beyond any other country and completely unrelated to crime. It's simply a way of controlling what used to be called the dangerous classes, the people who there's nothing much to do with, who don't contribute to wealth formation at the current moment. In Latin America, there's the same problem. It's handled in different ways. Sometimes in Colombia, for example, it's handled by something called social cleansing, in case of social. You send out the death squads and murder. The United States is more civil. You put them in jail. Some places it's handled by driving them out into the countryside so they starve. There are different ways of handling. Remember, we live in a world in which about close to a third of the population is unemployed in the technical sense, means they don't have enough work to survive. That's a fantastic catastrophe of the economic system. There's a huge amount of work to be done. Heck, walk around any city in the world, the richest one, you'll find plenty of things that there are to do. You find plenty of people who'd be delighted to do that work. But the economic system is such a catastrophic failure that it cannot put idle hands to needed work. So you have a lot of people who simply have nothing to do because the economic system is such a disastrous failure. Well, you do something with them. In Colombia, you kill them. Here you stick them in slums, favelas. In the United States, you put them in jail. The jail population has been going up exactly as the neoliberal policies have been increasing, for perfectly obvious reasons. As The United States has been undergoing its own form of neoliberalism since around the late 1970s. Wages are steadily going down, benefits are going down, working conditions are getting worse. All the usual, the support systems are declining. All the usual phenomena, becoming more like a third world society. And one result is you just have disposable people, as they're called in many parts of Latin America. Well, in the United States, you jail them. That's what the drug war is about. The drug war has almost nothing to do with drugs. I mean, every criminologist knows this. You read it in technical literature or wherever else. But the drug war has a lot to do with control of the population. For one thing, it's simply black males are targets. Black males between adolescents, 15 years old until maybe 40. Good chance that they're either in jail or in the justice system somewhere, maybe a PAL or waiting for jail or something like that. And they are the disposable people. The jailing is going up mostly for drug-related charges. And these are what are called victimless crimes. It's not that anyone's doing anything to anyone else. They're just caught with marijuana and pot or something. That's the way you get rid of the disposable people, you put them in jail. And by now it's a big industry. I mean, it's such a big industry. It's called the crime control industry. It is now so big that the huge publicly subsidized private corporations, what are called the defense industry, nothing to do with defense of the welfare of the rich. The big military industries are now looking at the crime control industry as a new source of profit. This is public funds, after all, just like the Pentagon. And they think, that, maybe rightly, that they can find new ways of using public funds to pay the costs of high technology and high salaries and high profits by going into the crime control business. So it may turn out in a few years, keep your eye on it, it may turn out that the level of people in prison actually declines because new surveillance techniques are being devised with high technology equipment where you stick electrodes on people and you control them with supercomputers. So if they walk across the room in the wrong direction, they can be in the wrong apartment. But if they move in the wrong direction or they pick up the telephone, there's maybe they get a shot. There's a signal that goes off somewhere that the security forces take a look and so on. These are things that are being experimented with now, and they'll probably be around pretty soon. And the public will be paying for them. And it will be a way to deal with disposable people. A reflection of the catastrophic failure of the economics. Right now, the trick that's used is drugs, but some other trick can be used. So the state of civil rights is a complicated affair. As a general rule, it seems the United States is not a capitalist country. A capitalist country could not survive for 5 minutes, and besides, the wealthy would never permit it. They want a lot of state power to support them, so they don't want a free market, they don't want capitalism. But if you look at the spectrum of societies, the United States is sort of toward the capitalist end of the spectrum. Now, in a capitalist society, everything becomes a commodity, like shoes. There should be a lot of shoes, and you should be able to buy as many of them as you have dollars. Okay, that's a capitalist economy. Well, as you get towards a more capitalist economy, freedom becomes an economy too, and civil rights and justice. It's all a commodity. There should be a lot of it available in principle, and you get about as much as you can buy. So if you're more privileged and more wealthy, you can buy a lot, and your civil rights are preserved. So you can get good lawyers, and you're protected from the criminal system, and you have a lot of rights, and everything's fine. If you're poor, the rights are all there, but you can't buy them. So they may be there on paper, but they're not available. And that's the way capitalist society works. To the extent that there's a market of rights also.
sobre a atual política econômica no Brasil, a adoção de uma perspectiva neoliberal, muito clara, e há duas perguntas que podem ser relacionadas. A primeira diz quando o atual presidente da República venceu as eleições, o senhor deu uma entrevista a um grande jornal brasileiro dizendo que havia uma aliança espúria que faria um enorme estrago na história dos movimentos populares e de esquerda brasileiros. Além disso, dada a política internacional norte-americana face à América Latina, qual o lugar do Brasil com essa política neoliberal para os planos dos Estados Unidos? E a Amazônia e o narcotráfico entram nesse plano? Eu sei que é uma salada de frutas, mas eram 10 perguntas.
I have lots of interviews tonight. But I gather that the reference is to a comment that maybe I made, I don't remember, about the alliance between the president
How are you saying?
Where does Brazil fit into the general neoliberal policy? Well, first of all, remember that the neoliberal policy is a very old policy. I think it goes back a couple hundred years. And the reason the third world is the third world is that it's been subjected more or less to neoliberalism, which the rich countries never accepted for themselves. I talked about that last night and repeat. So there's nothing new about it. Brazil fits the same way it's always fit. Brazil is part of the service areas. The world is roughly divided into the countries that managed to free themselves from Europe, the United States, and colonies. And then the rest of the world, which is mostly a service area, supposed to serve the rich. Its functions, its resources are supposed to flow to the rich. It has wealthy classes who are supposed to be very happy and wealthy. That was true even in the colonial period. It was true in Central Africa. It was true in India, the British Empire. The wealthy class that was super wealthy, in fact, loved the British, thought it was fantastic, while the population was collapsing. So part of the arrangement is a thin layer of wealthy classes linked to foreign power, living very nicely, really part of the first world. The third world, usually guarded, well guarded, so they don't see the rest of the third world. You can go in most third world cities, very poor cities, and you can travel from the airport to the five-star hotel to the theater. Practically don't know there are poor people around. There are sectors, the way it's worked out, it's possible to be quite wealthy and not know what's happening. Incidentally, I should say that's even true of the rich countries. So take my own city, Boston, very rich city. I'm sure most of the people who live around where I live don't know that the city hospital in Boston, which serves poor people, a couple of years ago, as a result of the neoliberal policies, had to open a malnutrition clinic for children because they're suffering from third world levels of malnutrition in one of the richest cities in the world. Most people don't know that. You don't see it. It's sort of off there or somewhere else. And in third world, it's even more divided. So that's the third world. The wealth, the resources go to the rich. A sector of the population participates. And they, of course, make the arrangements are just fine. That's an old story. And it changes because history is never constant. So there's different circumstances at different periods. Up until 1945, Brazil was not within the U.S. system. It was within the European system. It was Britain and France were the main powers in South America. The United States wasn't strong. After 1945, it's been mostly a U.S. system. Now Europe and Japan are entering, and even South Korea in the Amazon, for example, which is part of the Japanese system. So there are all kinds of complications and so on. But the basic idea remains the same. It's remained the same for hundreds of years. How Brazil decides, Brazil has a lot of choices. Brazil isn't Somalia. This is a rich country, tremendous resources, and all sorts of huge population, lots of possibilities. It's mostly an internal problem. I mean, Brazil has always, like other countries of Latin America, has suffered severely from the fact that the state is subjected to the rich. They have few obligations, so therefore they are free to maintain the basic imperial structure. Capital flowing out, goods flowing in, the usual things. But those are problems that have to be dealt with internally. Now, of course, when a country tries, even a country as powerful as Brazil tries to deal with them internally, they're going to be powerful pressures. So the military coup in 1964 was in part a result of efforts to democratize Brazil. That wasn't going to be accepted, so generals come in and put a stop to it with U.S. support. But I think that's less likely now. The world has changed. The diffusion of power is different, and there are other possibilities, in particular because Latin American countries have worked together, and also because of international solidarity. So a good part of the population of the United States is coming to understand that their fate and destiny is linked to that of most of the people of the world, and furthermore, they're going to look at perfectly decent people. If they know that their policies are making people suffer, they don't like it. There are all kinds of ways of connecting constructive links which offer new options, and Brazil could go in that direction. But these are mainly choices that have been struggles that have been fought here. Others can help. The battleground is right here. Just in Washington, where I live, the battleground is there, and others can help. As for the drug war, the drug war is mostly a consequence, is an aspect of neoliberalism. So at home in the United States, the drug war is mostly intended to control the population. It's to control one part of the population and to frighten another part. One of the ways to control people is frighten them, make them afraid of some terrible monsters coming after them. So you frighten, you get rid of the useless population, the disposable people, and you frighten everybody else. That's basically the drug war in the United States. Everyone knows that if you want to stop the consumption, reduce the consumption of drugs, the way to do it is education. And just overwhelmingly, it's more effective. Criminal measures have virtually no effect. Perfectly well known, not done that, because the purpose is control of the population. Well, what about abroad? Abroad, the United States is facing a sort of problem. If you take, say, Bolivia and Peru, the two major cocaine producers, manufacturers here, they produce it. Why do they produce it? It's one of the few successes of neoliberalism. Neoliberal policies were applied very successfully in Bolivia and Peru. So poor Bolivian farmers were taught the lesson that you're not supposed to produce things that people can eat in Bolivia. You're supposed to be overwhelmed by imports from U.S. agribusiness, which was subsidized and wipes you out, and you're supposed to produce for export. and it's supposed to be a good capital that makes the most money. Okay, they understood. So they're producing for export, and they're producing the crop that makes the most money, which happens to be cocoa. So cocaine production is in Bolivia and Peru. And in fact, the World Bank thinks it's terrific. It's stabilized the currency. It's exports are growing. Economic statistics are right. The professors in Chicago are cheering. It's just fine. It's working just fine. And they're right. That's the way capitalism is. It happens to be producing lots of cocaine, and that's what the economy relies on. But it's a rational capitalist market. Meanwhile, the United States is trying to stop it. But it's got a problem because it's weakened the state. Part of the goal is to eliminate the democratic sphere by putting more power into the hands of multinational corporations. But then the state's weaker, and what do you do when everybody's producing, exporting? Well, you got to increase the military component of the state. So at the same time, the United States is increasing the military component of the state and decreasing the public component. And meanwhile, introducing policies which lead to export of cocoa. The same thing happened in Colombia. I mean, wheat growing was pretty much wiped out by U.S. subsidized agriculture when the coffee-producing countries tried to sort of regulate the prices so that they didn't, shoot up and back in a crazy fashion, but were more or less administered. The U.S. wouldn't permit it. And Colombian coffee growers, many of them were small farmers, just went out of business. They started doing something else. Well, what are they doing? Cocaine started coming to the United States. In fact, if you look at the drug policy, from the point of view of control of drugs, it's madness. For example, marijuana happens to be very big and bulky, so it's easy to stop. It's easy to control. So Colombian marijuana was stopped pretty easily. Then they just became rational, shifted to something that's harder to find. High technology drugs, like cocaine, which is an industrial product. So it's small, hard to stop. Incidentally, cocaine requires chemicals. And in fact, the flow of chemicals from the United States to Latin America is way in excess of any industrial use. That incidentally is well known. It was reported by the CIA in the 80s and also by the Congressional Research Office. So you want to stop cocaine production, one of the best ways to do it is to go to the offices of the chemical companies, American Sanam and so on, throw them all in jail. That'll stop cocaine production a lot faster than the black kid in the street. The money from cocaine, from the drug distribution, I'll mention a small figure from the most recent Department of Commerce reports in the United States. The U.S. Department of Commerce comes out with figures every year on foreign direct investment. The last year for which there are detailed figures is 1994. That was the year of the big emerging markets in Latin America. Everybody's excited about the emerging markets in Latin America. Real great stuff coming out of the recession. Wonderful. All right, take a look at the 1994 figures. Look at the Western Hemisphere. Last time. Look at the Western Hemisphere, and you exclude Canada, which is really part of Europe. For the rest of the hemisphere, 25% of foreign direct investment from the United States goes to Bermuda. Another 15% or so goes to other tax havens. That's around 40%. Most of the rest is speculative money, floating in and out. Well, what's doing there? Are they building factories in Bermuda? It's dirty money, tax-free money. Nobody knows what it is. A lot of it may be non-direct money. Most of it is good for U.S. banks anyway. Anyway, the drug war has nothing to do with drugs. It has plenty to do with imposing neoliberal policies on Latin America and controlling populations at home. I'm sorry, there's a lot more to say about this, but I'm being told time's up.
Bem, pessoal, antes do nosso encerramento aqui, né, da Marilena e Maria Vitória falar dos agradecimentos para o professor Chomsky, eu gostaria de pedir a vocês, mais uma vez, eu já tive um pedido especial de manhã, e que eu gostaria de fazer agora junto. Eu sei que todo mundo gostaria de pegar um autógrafo, um abraço, um bate-papo, do nosso estilo jeitinho brasileiro, mas infelizmente o professor já tem outro compromisso, então a gente vai se retirar imediatamente do palco e pediria a colaboração de vocês. Muito obrigado.
Agradece a presença de todos e agradece muito especialmente o professor Chomsky. Thank you, Mr. Chomsky. Thank you, Mrs. Carol Chomsky. Obrigada a todos. E reforço o pedido do professor Sérgio Pereira, professor Chomsky,